In this discussion, our concern is to narrate the history of the last large scale mass movement that the Congress organized against the British. We are referring to the Quit India movement in August 1942. This movement is also known as India's Revolution, considering the level of intensity that the movement was able to acquire in certain areas. Although we do not see this kind of intensity or uniformly all over the country, but there were pockets like Tomluk in Midnapur or Satara in Maharashtra, or certain regions of western and northern Bihar and eastern UP. These regions acquired a level of intensity that had never happened before. Moreover, the Congress volunteers who participated in this popular struggle were not always bound by the doctrine of nonviolence. I mean, compared to the other movements, the Quit India movement also resorted to a high degree of violence, uprooting telegraph lines, destroying railway tracks, attacking police stations, which became fairly recurrent in some of those pockets where the movement achieved a high degree of intensity. Congressmen at the local level, under the leadership of essentially local leaders, set up alternative governments known as Prati Sarkars or Jatiya Sarkars.
Excuse me, sir. What was the impact of the war situation on the Congress?
The congressmen had different perceptions about the war. Some people like Jawaharlal Nehru believed that since the war was against fascist powers, it was necessary not to embarrass the British by starting an agitation. Others thought differently. Take, for example, the position that Bose had taken, who was very anxious to strike the empire the last fatal blow. And this is a perception which was shared by many other congressmen who had by then become very angry with the kind of indifference that the British had shown to Congress demands for self-government. So Bose ultimately came to practice his beliefs by migrating to Europe and then to Southeast Asia, but which is a different story. But the war becomes relevant for other reasons, as we see the background to the Quit India movement. We see between, say, 1937 and 1940-41, many discordant trends in Indian politics. We all know that by then League had come up with its Pakistan proposal. The Congress ministries, the governments that the Congress had formed in as many as 8 states, by then had become somewhat tarnished. We know the performance of these provincial governments. Many of their legislations and actions were directed against peasants, against working classes. So the Congress ministries were also, to a large extent, going back on the kind of radical promises that they had made earlier. Obviously, in popular perception, the Congress's image became somewhat soiled by the experience of the people with the Congress ministries. Secondly, Congress itself became somewhat weakened during this period by factional divisions, by ideological conflicts. We all know that the Congress Socialists had emerged as a very powerful ginger group within the organization with completely different political visions, often radical political visions, socialist political visions. The controversy that surrounded the election of Subhash Bose in the Tripuri session of the Congress as Congress president for the second time also made Congress vulnerable to factional conflicts. Bose had substantial followers who broke away from the Congress and set up the forward bloc by following their leaders. Once Bose was expelled from the Congress for not actually towing the line of the High Command after he had to resign from the Congress presidency, failing to carry his working committee with him. So you see certain ruptures within the Congress organization. You see the failure of the Congress government to some extent to live up to the promises that they had made earlier. And the war itself was capable of creating ideological divides. I have just mentioned that some congressmen would be keen to strike a blow at the empire when the empire was somewhat weak, facing war on different fronts. And others, like including Nehru, for example, would be inclined to the view that since fighting the fascist was of greater importance at that particular moment, it may not be actually morally correct, it may not be wise for the Congress to start an agitation. So within this particular context, the decisions to start another agitation was actually offering the Congress a way out of the kind of rut that the Congress organizations were facing. But before the Congress actually arrived at this decision, the Congress leaders had to deliberate on the possible consequences of their decision to start another movement. We are all aware of the discussions in the Congress Working Committee in early 1942, since late 1941. There was realization that some action needed to be taken, particularly when the British government actually refused to comply with the Congress demand for a certain declaration of their intention to give India self-government after the war. And that was one issue on which a major division took place between the British and the Congress governments in the provinces. The Congress ministries resigned on the ground that the British refused to consult the Congress regarding Indian participation in the war. What Congress demanded was a certain promise by the British to grant India self-government after the war. The British were not willing to make that kind of a declaration even in 1939. So this kind of disenchantment lurking in the background, the failure of the Cripps Mission certainly stiffened Congress attitudes towards the British.
Sir, why did the Cripps Mission fail, or why did the Congress reject Cripps' proposal?
You are familiar with the basic intention of the Cripps Mission, are also aware of the context in which the Cripps Mission was sent to India. And it has some relevance with the developing war situation. The British had to fight this war along with their allies, and the Chinese leadership, leaders like Chiang Kai-shek, the American President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, insisted on the British making an announcement about their intention to give India a measure of self-government. So in order to silence international criticism when international cooperation was urgently necessary for fighting a war, the national government under Winston Churchill decided to send Cripps, Stafford Cripps, a Labour Party MP, to India to negotiate with the Congress leaders. Cripps was sent to India in order to project a different image of Britain internationally, in order to assuage international criticism about how the British were refusing to grant India independence. But at the same time, Cripps was instructed to keep within his limits, or some of the objectives of the Cripps Mission were not very clearly defined. Churchill and others simply banked on the hope that Cripps, because of his connections with Indian leaders like Nehru, would be able to strike out a compromise with the Congress on the issue of war effort, would be able to rally the Congress behind the imperial government in actually pursuing the war against Germany and the fascist powers. But Cripps occasionally exceeded the limits defined or set out by his colleagues in Britain. Take, for example, the question of India's defense or the defense portfolio. The idea was that there should be a cabinet in India in which Indians would be represented, and each member of the cabinet would be assigned a certain portfolio. Then it suggested the possibility of creating a constituent assembly in which, apart from the elected representatives, there should be representatives from the princes and from the provinces, and such representatives of the princely states and the provinces would have the right to withdraw from the constituent assembly if they so desired. And the immediate relevance was the induction of Indians as responsible ministers in the Viceroy's Council in charge of different departments. So, on each of these counts, around each of these issues, there were disagreements. The Congress was extremely apprehensive about the right that was accorded to the representatives of the princely states to withdraw from the Constituent Assembly. They thought that this was a deliberate design to divide India. On the other hand, the Viceroy Linlithgow and the Wavell, the Commander-in-Chief, became apprehensive about the way Cripps was exceeding his limit and visualizing the creation of some kind of a cabinet system in India. Linlithgow and Wavell felt that departments like defense should not be entrusted with an Indian minister. So, between the British Indian bureaucracy, supported by the conservative British political establishment and the Congress, there were serious points of disagreement regarding the manner in which Cripps was actually setting out the constitutional proposals for India's future political development after the war. The Congress leadership therefore read this as a certain kind of indifference among the British political establishment about India's legitimate demands for self-government. I would imagine that such disappointments with the Cripps Mission and the disgruntlement among congressmen that the failure of the Cripps Mission actually created ultimately stiffened Gandhi's attitude towards the British. So that when the Quit India resolution was passed and then finally endorsed in early August in the working committee session in Bombay on the 8th August, Gandhi definitely showed a more belligerent attitude, far more belligerent than Gandhi had ever had shown to the British during the earlier movements. Karenge ya marenge. Gandhi was actually calling upon his followers to take on this fight to the finish. So, this Karenge ya marenge, this particular expression actually shows how the call was given to the congressmen to strike this last blow and to fight this battle to the finish. So, the kind of rhetoric that you see being employed by Gandhi and the Congress leadership in this movement was expected to generate the kind of unprecedented militancy that we come across in the Quit India movement. It is largely because of the disgruntlement created by the failure of the Cripps Mission. British intentions were doubted. They became suspicious about what the British actually wished to do. So the point was for the Congress to strike this fatal blow on the empire at its weakest moment. It created a level of militancy that had never happened before. but the element of control that the Congress organizations and the leadership had always maintained over the participants in the mass struggles earlier. We are all familiar with the whole theory about a controlled movement. This was largely absent.
Sir, then are we to believe that the Quit India movement, because of its spontaneity, did not at all remain a controlled movement?
Yes, I mean, the control aspect was missing. Historians describe it as a spontaneous upsurge, largely because of the fact that once that Quit India resolution was endorsed by the Congress Working Committee, the top-ranking leadership of the Congress was put behind the bars. Immediately they were arrested, leaving behind the second tier of leadership and local leadership. During the Quit India movement, we come across a good deal of activity by this second tier of leadership, in which some of the Congress socialists figured as prominent actors. You have Achyut Patwardhan, Jayaprakash Narayan, who played a very important role in the Quit India mobilization in North Bihar along the Nepal border. You have Aruna Asaf Ali and many others who were affiliated with the Congress socialists and who wished to take the Congress movement towards a radical direction, found an opportunity to translate some of their ideas into political practice in the absence of the upper tier of the Congress leadership. You have the followers of Subhash Chandra Bose, for example, who had become somewhat disgruntled, somewhat disenchanted with the Gandhian leadership, and also found an opportunity to translate their radicalism into practice. And you have local leadership as well. Congress organization in the localities, mainly peasants, but also local intelligentsia, introduced a level of militancy into the movement that we do not see in the earlier movements. So the point is that this element of spontaneity that we see was a natural consequence of the temporary withdrawal or the temporary elimination of the upper tier of the Congress leadership. These Congress organizations began to work out their strategies locally, often going to a point which would not ordinarily have been endorsed by Gandhi. Even though Gandhi, during the Quit India movement, expressed his approval of violence if self-defense required violent means. But the violence that had taken place during the Quit India movement was a kind of an elemental, spontaneous violence that Gandhi would never allow in situations where he has perfect control over the organizations for the movement to drift into this kind of violence. Telegraph lines were uprooted, railway line tracks were disturbed, police stations were ransacked and attacked. And all this is indicative of the kind of militancy that was generated by the Quit India movement and the leadership being passed into the hands of local organizations who, as if they had found the time or the opportunity to become their own masters. During the Quit India movement, we see an early phase where students were very active in large number. There were pockets like Jamshedpur or Ahmedabad where worker strikes took place. It even continued in certain cases for a very long time. But the urban movement gradually petered out. So from around the middle of August, the focus shifted to the countryside with students from universities going into the countryside and mobilizing the Congress organizations at the local level, dominated as they were by the peasants, propertied peasants. And during this rural mobilization, during the time when the Congress organizers became more focused on organizing rural movements in the rural areas, we come across attempts by the more radically inclined leaders to resort to certain means which had not earlier been approved by the Gandhian leadership. And as a consequence of this, we come across another very distinctive feature of the movement, whereby we see that there were pockets in which the movement achieved unprecedented intensity. I was mentioning those regions, Satara region in Maharashtra, where this movement became linked with an already ongoing movement of the low caste people against Brahminical orthodoxy. The congressmen in that locality succeeded in forging their connections with this low caste initiative. You have Jayaprakash Narayan's activity among the Bihar peasants in northern and western Bihar, where already a good deal of militancy had been created, that had been created by Kisan Sabha mobilization. The same can be said about eastern UP, the district of Balia. You have Medinapur, Tomluk region in West Bengal, where similar things had happened. So the point that historians usually make in characterizing the movement concerns the great intensity in limited pockets while leaving a large part of the country quiet. So if you look at southern India, unlike in the civil disobedience movements, in southern India you don't see much of activity. Even if they were incapable of reaching this kind of high level of intensity. Northwestern frontier provinces, which became so active, so volatile during the civil disobedience movement, had not been able to renew the agitation on the same scale. So, as a consequence of this kind of spontaneous upsurge, the absence of the upper tier of Congress leadership, some kind of loosening of organizational control, concentration on local leadership to fight it out at the ground level, all this was responsible for a greater degree of militancy but lesser spread effect. Lastly, one has to talk about the alternative governments, the Prati Sarkars or the Jatiya Sarkars that these rebels in the locality had.
Where were these alternative governments set up and how did this alternative government function?
That is the point that I was actually trying to make. We see it happening in Balia where it survived for some time. We see it in Satara where it lasted up to 1946. You have the Jatiya Sarkar experiment in Midnapur in Tomluk where they created several outfits of this Jatiya Sarkar. They had their own military commands, had their own administrative setups. In a way, this is more symbolic than real, but at the same time, it shows the willingness on the part of the Congress volunteers at the local level to create a semblance of administrative structure in order to replace the existing imperial authority. You are all familiar with the name of Sushil Dhara in Midnapur. He was a leading figure in the local national government at Tomluk. He was the leader of the Bidyut Bahini, the national military of the kind that was set up at Tomluk. So these people made an effort to derive taxes from the rich in order to sustain their activity. So there was an attempt to create an alternative framework of government, at least at the local level, which shows how the Congress at the local level, wherever this movement achieved intensity, were looking for creation of an alternative framework of government. So if we are to sum up this discussion now, we see how after 1942, the Congress once again returns to the strategy of negotiations. Even when they started the movement, the Congress leadership was very ambivalent about this. There were many congressmen who, despite Gandhi's endorsement of the Quit India resolution, felt that it was better to carry on negotiations with the British to extract constitutional concessions. Nehru felt that Congress could have avoided this kind of a massive agitation for entirely different reasons. There was, in any case, some amount of ambivalence among Congress leadership about this movement. And even though the ordinary congressmen were so angry that once they got the opportunity to assert their independence, managed to achieve a high level of intensity. But 42 movement eventually collapsed, as all movements do. And once that happened, the Congress returned to the constitutional mold. And as you go to the later part of the decade, late 40s, you see a more complex scenario where agitations were being organized by left, by communists, by socialists, and the Congress moving towards power by conducting a series of negotiations with the British.